In order for the world's first televised genocide, this is a genocide that people have been watching on their TV screens, on their phone, live. For it to last for over 15 months shows that there is a system that has been enabling the genocide to continue unhindered and unchallenged.
Today we have a very special guest with us, Dr Ghassan Abu-Sittah, a British-Palestinian reconstructive surgeon who has served in numerous conflict zones, including the war-torn Gaza Strip. You've consistently talked about the tragic consequences that Israel's offensive has had at Gaza. And when it comes to children especially, can you describe or can you walk us through as to what you witnessed?
Half of the wounded, 50%, were children. With the progress of the war and the genocide and the use of famine as one of the tools of this genocide, you started to see malnutrition in these wounded children, which meant that their bodies cannot heal after the injury, their bodies do not do as well after the surgery. And now your chances of being killed as a doctor or a nurse in the Gaza Strip are 3.5 times those of the general population. So that shows that Israel has been intentionally wiping out a whole generation of health professionals.
How has your personal life been affected by all of this? Because it clearly seems that you are a wanted man.
The attempts by an organization called UK Lawyers for Israel to have my medical license withdrawn and to have me banned by the Charity Commission from holding office in any charity in the UK, and the ban in the United States. All of this is to ensure that the genocide continued. This is an attempt to silence those voices who came out to try to stop the genocide. And this is why the genocide continues, because there was a system.
How you perceive the media, because you've spoken quite critically of the Western media. And, what is your perspective?
At the end of the day, the media are tools of power. These media, the CNN, BBC, NBA, all of these are tools of power. They enabled the creation of an atmosphere that justified the initiation of the genocidal war. Then they watered down the news coming out and the horrors coming out in order to protect the genocide and stop it from the political backlash that exists.
Doctor, just one last question, and I hope you'll be honest with me. Do you not fear for your life?
I have to say what Gaza left me is extremely fatalistic. I shouldn't have come out of Gaza. There were lots of nights when I thought that was the end. And it made me have to face some soul searching that other people sometimes don't need to. And I've come to the following conclusion: that a life that is short but well lived is better than a long life that is unlived.
Welcome to Newslaundry interviews. Today we have a very special guest with us, Dr Ghassan Abu-Sittah, a British-Palestinian reconstructive surgeon who has served in numerous conflict zones, including the war-torn Gaza Strip. Thank you for joining us, Doctor.
Thank you.
Doctor, my first question to you, and this is something to do with what you've spoken about quite frequently, children in Gaza. You've consistently talked about the tragic consequences that Israel's offensive has had at Gaza. And when it comes to children especially, can you describe or can you walk us through as to what you witnessed, in terms of treating children, and how does a doctor keep the emotions in check at such a tragic time? Because, if I'm not wrong, you did mention for the longest time that the biggest victims of this attack have been mostly women and children.
So from the very beginning, back in October 2023, we were noticing the fact that half of the wounded, 50%, were children. And we know from other wars that usually it's 25 to 30%. And so it was already very evident from the very beginning that half of those who were wounded were children. And the reason for that is that the primary and almost the sole target of Israeli attacks were people's homes. And so these kids were being brought from underneath the rubble when their homes were being bombed with the catastrophic injury, many of them requiring amputations. And that kind of destructive injury in a child requires repeated surgeries for the lifetime of that child. Now, with the progress of the war and the genocide and the use of famine as one of the tools of this genocide, you started to see malnutrition in these wounded children, which meant that their bodies cannot heal after the injury, their bodies do not do as well after the surgery. And now in the winter month, we have what's called the triad of death, which is hypothermia in a malnourished body, in a wounded child. And that's why we're getting kids who are dying of hypothermia, even though in the Middle East at night, temperatures will hover around 2 or 3 degrees centigrade. But a malnourished, wounded child, that is enough to kill them. And that's what's happening at the moment. You add to the mix the infectious diseases, which are the result of the destruction of water and sewage, and the fact that 85% of homes are destroyed and people live in these schools that are a center for the internally displaced. And so the epidemics that we're seeing of hepatitis A, of polio, of all of this, these are highly damaged and fragile bodies that are dying now at 3 degrees centigrade, 4 degrees centigrade.
I mean, I did remember reading one of your columns on Al Jazeera, and you mentioned that you spent a certain amount of time there, and despite leaving Gaza, your mind is still there. And if I'm not wrong, you did mention a lot about treating children even in that column, if I'm not wrong. But another thing which I wanted to ask, as a medical professional who has volunteered in Gaza, Dr. Ghassan Abu-Sittah has been detained. I mean, the Israeli forces have confirmed that they've detained him. And you yourself have been putting out posts on the social media platform X, advocating for his release and so on. But not too long ago, when we spoke last year, we had connected shortly after the bombing at Al-Ahli hospital, and you had held a press conference after that. Can you elaborate more on the threats that medical workers, doctors face when they work in such a conflict zone, especially in the Gaza Strip, and even from the experiences in Lebanon?
So on the 17th of October 2023, when the Israelis bombed Al-Ahli hospital, killing over 480 civilians, it became obvious that the destruction and the systematic dismantlement of the health system was going to be a central tenet of the Israeli military doctrine. And we saw that after Al-Ahli hospital, they destroyed 3 pediatric hospitals, and then they besieged Shifa, and the whole narrative about militarizing and criminalizing Shifa, and then the first attack on Shifa, and then the second attack and the massacre in Shifa after the second attack, and now, even after the arrest of Dr. Abu-Sittah and the destruction of Kamal Udwan, the following day, Israel bombed Rafah hospital. And what people didn't know is that the medical students at the Gaza Islamic University were sitting their exams in Rafah hospital, and Israel tried to kill them. And then the following day, they bombed Al-Ahli again, a few days ago. And so what we see is an intentional, systematic destruction with the aim of increasing the genocidal death toll through the destruction of the health system, so that the wounded die of their wounds, that the chronically ill develop, die of these illnesses because they're being untreated. And there's going to be research that is about to be published that shows that your chances of being killed as a doctor or a nurse in the Gaza Strip are 3.5 times those of the general population. So that shows that Israel has been intentionally wiping out a whole generation of health professionals. And so now over 1,000 have been killed, over 100 medical students have been killed, and over 400 health professionals are in this torture camp, in this internment camp, Sidi Tinman, that the Israelis have killed so far 2 doctors in. Dr. Adnan al-Bursh was tortured to death. Dr. Iyad al-Rantisi was tortured to death. And now we believe that Dr. Abu Safi has been taken to that internment camp. And so what we see is a dismantlement, not just of the buildings and the infrastructure, but also of the human resources, so that a whole generation.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but from what I understand, what you're mentioning is also that you're saying that they keep the Israeli forces are making it a place which is rather you can't inhabit such a place in the future. They're blowing it down to rubble. But I also wanted to ask you, when I spoke to you last time, you were most reluctant to leave Gaza, from what I understood. But from what the reports I read, and correct me if I'm wrong, some of the headlines said that surgeon had to flee in that sense. Can you take me back as to what happened there?
So when we ran out of anesthetic medication at Al-Ahli hospital, I made the decision of leaving the north and going south to try to find a functioning hospital that I can work in as a surgeon. My ability to work is limited by my access to operating room. When I got to the south, because of the siege, because of the lack of fuel, I realized that there were the issue in the system wasn't the lack of surgeons. It was that the Israelis had prevented the delivery of medication, of surgical consumables, of fuel for the operating. So when I got in touch with the UK Foreign Office, they contacted the Israelis so that I would leave. And then the Israelis came back basically saying that he's not allowed to leave and that try again in 2 weeks' time.
Okay.
That really kind of got me worried that at that time it was obvious that the Israelis were selectively targeting doctors.
But if I may interrupt, you have also mentioned quite a bit in the past that you have been a person of interest for the Israeli forces. In terms of even when you tried to enter Germany, if I'm not wrong, you'd given an interview where it mentioned that you were not allowed to go there. And even if you were to give a Zoom interview or any video material, that you would face prison or a fine, if I'm not wrong. So, you have made quite a few allegations in the past. And, if I'm not wrong, there was also a visit by, I think last year when we had spoken, you said that the British counterterrorism police had landed up at your doorstep. So how has your personal life been affected by all of this? Because it clearly seems that you are a wanted man.
So, in order for the world's first televised genocide, this is a genocide that people have been watching on their TV screens, on their phones, live. For it to last for over 15 months shows that there is a system that has been enabling the genocide to continue unhindered and unchallenged. And what you describe in terms of first the Germany ban and then the ban to the whole of the Schengen area, which is Europe plus Switzerland and Norway. And the attempts by an organization called UK Lawyers for Israel to have my medical license withdrawn and to have me banned by the Charity Commission from holding office in any charity in the UK, and the ban in the United States. All of this is to ensure that the genocide continued. This is an attempt to silence those voices who came out to try to stop the genocide. And this is why the genocide continues, because there was a system, not only a system that in Germany increased the supply of ammunition and weapons tenfold. In the United States, $40 billion of aid went to Israel since the beginning of the genocide, and countless bombs. And in the UK, the government refused to put an arms ban on Israel, and that the Royal Air Force provides electronic surveillance for the Israelis over Gaza. But there is also a system of, and recently there was an article about the role of this editor this pro-Israel editor in the BBC, whose job it is to water down any news at the BBC
I would like to interrupt you there, because one of my questions here was also about how you perceive the media, because you've spoken quite critically of the Western media, and what is your perspective? I think we all know to a certain extent, but if you could make it clear as to how you see the media coverage of this, because which you have described is quite one-sided, and in favor of Israel.
One-sided. At the end of the day, the media are tools of power. These media, the CNN, BBC, NBA, all of these are tools of power. And if you look at the different phases of this genocide, initially, through the invention of false stories about beheaded babies, and they enabled the creation of an atmosphere that justified the initiation of the genocidal war. Then they watered down the news coming out and the horrors coming out in order to protect the genocide and stop it from the political backlash that existed. And now what we're noticing is what liberals always do, which is, now that the war in its full horror has become known, what liberal institutions in the West, and even Zionist liberal institutions, will try to do is frame these crimes in terms of excesses, in terms of violations, in terms of the fog of war. And so they'll report some of them, but they report them in a way to try to show that these are individual excesses by individual Israeli officers or individual Israeli divisions, rather than a structural genocide that actually went to plan, and the horrors of it are an intrinsic component of that structural genocide. And more importantly, that the idea that there is a third party in this genocide called Western governments is false. Western government, this is an American genocide and a British genocide and a German genocide and a French genocide that uses Israel as a tool, as the stick to beat the Palestinians with. And that's what now the current phase of what we watch in the narrative of Western liberal news outlets is the excesses and the violations, rather than the fact that this was a project. It was from the beginning a genocidal project. It now still is a genocidal project in which famine is used, denial of access to drinking water is used, bombing, ethnic cleansing. All of these horrors are part of the genocidal machine and are not excesses or violations. They are the plan, and these actions show that things are going according to plan. And now we have 10 to 15% of Gaza's population that have been either killed or wounded. 3 times more than the Second World War in France.
You were just mentioning that, and it took me back to the last time we spoke, and you were in the middle of surgeries, and you'd taken out a good 10 to 15 minutes to speak to me over phone, and you did mention that the frequency was a patient every 10 minutes in Gaza, and you have also, if I'm not wrong, you've also volunteered in Lebanon, and I just wanted to ask how, as time went by, and it's been a year, it's been more than a year, as time went by, how did this situation change? Were you attending to more patients every 10 minutes, or was it?
What is worse now, speaking to my colleagues in Gaza, is the condition, the physical condition of the wounded when they arrive. So you're getting malnourished patients coming in. You're getting patients on their second or third injury coming in. So that, a friend of mine was saying that that he gets patients pulled from under the rubble who already have the external fixators because they've been previously wounded. Or what Professor Nick Maynard witnessed in Gaza when he was there, that the patients are so malnourished, their wounds will not heal after the surgery and they open up again. And so that's what you're now killing an already malnourished and even starving body, and you're re-wounding those who were wounded the first time round but survived.
Another question I did want to ask you, Doctor, and you've often been described as a war surgeon. Like that's a designation I see quite as well. And you have served, when I read up about you and research about you, you have served in numerous zones of conflict. But after your recent, I mean, not that you've not been voicing out these allegations before, but after your recent return to UK from Lebanon, you had mentioned that, and I quote from a post on Twitter, that pro-Israel organizations have been targeting doctors who speak out and try to relay what they have witnessed in Gaza. Can you elaborate a bit more on that? Because we have had a conversation on this, but specifically, because I also want to understand how the medical community also seems a bit divided on this.
So currently in the UK, there are over 60 doctors who have had complaints lodged against them by an organization called UK Lawyers for Israel to have their medical license withdrawn by the General Medical Council.
But on what?
And I'm one of them.
But on what?
So basically, it's a kind of standard support for terrorism and anti-Semitism. That's the kind of standard accusation for anybody who speaks against this genocide. And we know that similar processes have happened in Canada and in the United States, but at the hospital level. But in the UK, because the hospitals are all part of a central national health service, it happens at the General Medical Council. And it's part of that. The pro-Israel lobby understands the power of the witness statement of a doctor. And so it really, and the aim of this is to create a culture of fear so that people self-censor, so that they look at someone like me, who's on their second complaint at the General Medical Council with all of the expenses that has in terms of not just financial, but in terms of mental and emotional toll, and think, okay, I'm going to just not say anything. And on the other side, it was obvious. I mean, so in October, and I don't know whether it had happened by the time we spoke in last year in October. In October, 150 Israeli doctors, 150 Israeli doctors paid for an ad to go out in the newspaper, which was a letter calling on the Israeli army to target Shifa Hospital.
That sounds very concerning.
And neither did any of the British Medical Association or the Royal Colleges or the American Medical Association or the Australian Medical or the French or anyone try to take the Israelis up on this, and the Israeli Medical Association for failing to censor these people. But even when, so Dr. Ahmad Maqadme had won a global competition by the Royal College of Surgeons for his humanitarian surgery. And when he was executed by the Israelis at Shifa Hospital, the Royal College first did not want to comment on his murder. And when it did, it was so watered down that it said, we mourn his loss as if he was run over by a car or had a disease. And Dr. Adnan al-Bursh, who had been trained at King's College administration refused to comment on the fact that one of their graduates was tortured to death for being a doctor. And so you could see that the two-pronged complicity of these institutions of power. These are institutions of power. Interestingly, in the UK, they were created as part of the colonial effort. And so their colonial roots in the UK are much clearer than elsewhere. Certainly, they're much clearer than the United States, but as clear in Europe, in France. These are colonial institutions. And suddenly, after decades of this public relations work on decolonization and all of that, and benign brown faces in visible positions of power, you discover that actually they haven't changed. These institutions have not changed. They serve the interests of the ruling class in the United Kingdom. They serve the interests of the ruling class in France. And that ruling class, whether it's the British or the French or the German or the United States, this is their genocidal war. This is their war. They're not third parties witnessing or even colluding. They are part of the genocidal machine.
But Doctor, you mentioned Dr. Makadame, and it took me back to when you had shared his contact with me, and I had spoken to him about a story for what doctors in Gaza were going through. And I do remember when his death was announced, and it was quite sad. Like, and I wanted to ask, as someone who has lost so many colleagues, friends, if I'm not wrong, you've been in and out of conflict zones quite frequently to treat people. Would you ever go back now? Or would
Absolutely. And this has been proven by CNN, who wrote an article. Israel is actively preventing doctors of Palestinian origin, so even if they're American Palestinians, British Palestinians, from entering with the medical humanitarian team. So the reason why I'm not back in Gaza is because I, like all doctors of Palestinian origin, were prevented from entering Gaza. Since Israelis took control of the Rafah border, you have to go through the Israelis, and the Israelis put a ban on all Palestinian or people of Palestinian origin from entering.
A lot of people would say that is straight out racism in one sense.
Absolutely. And what is shocking is the world would not accept a country saying we will not take doctors of African origin or doctors of Chinese origin or doctors of Indian origin. But when it comes to Palestinian, Israeli exceptionalism is so this. I mean, now we're the night after New Year's Eve. This is the war that has shown the world for what it is, without the propaganda, without the public relations work, without the veils. And part of it is that Israel is above moral law, international law, and in a lot of places, even internal domestic law. The laws get changed to protect Israelis. And so Israeli exceptionalism is there. This is the war that has shown the rest of the world what Palestinians have always known since 1948, that Israel will get away with anything that it chooses to get away with.
And I did want to ask you this question. Since you've been in numerous zones of conflict, where do you see this ending?
Israel is still, I think there's an issue. Everybody asks, what is Gaza going to look like the day after? But actually, the real question is, what will Zionism look like the day after? And I think Israel's insistence on continuing the war endlessly and going from one war in Gaza to a war in Lebanon and now to a war in Syria is because it understands that there is no coming back from this genocide for the Zionist movement and for Israel. This is a society that will eat itself up. You cannot send your children, your boys, your brethren, your fathers to commit the kind of crimes that they've committed in Gaza and then take them home and think that they will behave like anything other than the serial killers that they've become.
Doctor, just one last question, and I hope you'll be honest with me. Do you not fear for your life?
Do I not fear for my life? I think I have to say what Gaza left me is extremely fatalistic. I shouldn't have come out of Gaza. There were lots of nights when I thought that was the end. And it made me have to face some soul searching that other people sometimes don't need to. And I've come to the following conclusion: that a life that is short but well lived is better than a long life that is unlived. And so I honestly, I've come to peace with this idea. And every time you have your doubts, you're retaught the essence of medicine and humanitarianism by people like Dr. Ghassan Abu-Sittah and Dr. Muhammad Abeid, who's also in prison now, who stayed in the north, and all of my colleagues in Gaza. They remain the beacon by which every health professional has to look and see what is pure about the essence of this profession.
Thank you so much, Doctor. I really appreciate your time with us, and I know it's a difficult hour for you.
Journalism at Newslaundry is powered by the public, because when the public pays, the public is served. Visit newslaundry.com/subscription and pick a payment plan of your choice. Pay to keep news free and independent. Your future, and indeed the future of democracy, depends on it.